Marissa Harris walked into the courtroom with a confident stride, the kind of confidence that comes from hours of preparation and an unwavering belief in her ability to succeed as a young black woman in the legal world today. It was just another day at work, or so she thought. She was representing her first high-profile client, a local business owner who had been caught up in a minor traffic violation, a case that seemed straightforward enough and within her control. As she took her seat in front of the judge, she adjusted the cuffs of her jacket and tried to steady her breath. Her heart was racing, not from fear, but from the excitement of proving herself once again. The courtroom buzzed with energy as people settled into their places. Marissa had seen judges in action before, but today was different. Judge Gregory Daniels was known for his stern and no-nonsense approach. Some of her colleagues had warned her about his old-school methods and sharp tone, but she was determined to face him head-on with professionalism and respect. She glanced at her client seated beside her, who seemed nervous but trusted her judgment. The case was simple, and she knew it would be easy to get a favorable result. Judge Daniels entered the room, and the chatter immediately quieted down. His imposing figure made the air feel heavier, but Marissa stood tall and maintained her composure. As he took his seat on the bench, his eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on her. He was known for being precise and demanding, and she was prepared for anything that came her way. The hearing started, and Marissa presented her client's case, articulating every detail of the traffic violation and explaining how it was a minor infraction that didn't warrant severe consequences. She outlined the evidence, clearly pointing out the mitigating circumstances that would work in their favor. The judge barely acknowledged her words. His attention seemed elsewhere, and his questions were sharp, almost dismissive. But Marissa didn't flinch. She answered each question with poise and calmness, making sure not to let his cold demeanor throw her off. As the session continued, Marissa began to feel a strange tension building in the air. Judge Daniels had started interrupting her responses and cutting her off mid-sentence with pointed remarks about her inexperience. He seemed determined to undermine her confidence. At every turn, his tone became more condescending with every passing minute, but Marissa pushed forward, holding on to the belief that the facts would win the day. When it was time for the judge to issue his ruling, she wasn't expecting much. She knew judges were rarely lenient in such cases, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. With a wave of his hand, Judge Daniels issued a fine so steep that it took Marissa by surprise. He called it a penalty for disrespect in his courtroom, a punishment for her supposed failure to heed his authority. Marissa blinked. As the words registered, she felt a knot form in her stomach. But before she could say anything, the judge moved on to the next case, leaving her standing there in disbelief. The fine was excessive and completely unjustified, but the sting of his accusation was what cut the deepest. She left the courtroom with her head held high, but her heart heavy, unsure of what had just happened or why her actions had earned such a harsh penalty. Marissa walked out of the courtroom, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just occurred. The fine was staggering, but it wasn't just the amount that left her unsettled. It was the judgment that had come with it, the accusation of disrespect for simply standing her ground in a courtroom full of seasoned professionals. It didn't make sense. She had followed every rule, every protocol, yet somehow she had ended up being the one punished for speaking her truth. She could still feel the weight of Judge Daniels' cold stare and the sting of his words echoing in her mind. Outside the courthouse, Marissa took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She could hear snippets of conversations from people walking by, some talking about their own cases, some sharing gossip about other lawyers, but no one seemed to notice the quiet storm brewing inside her. She walked to her car and slid into the driver's seat with a sigh. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as she stared at the road ahead. The injustice of it all hung over her like a dark cloud. The phone call came just as she was about to drive away. It was Derek a fellow attorney and a friend who had heard about what happened. He wasted no time getting to the point. "Have you heard about that fine?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Marissa paused for a moment, not sure how to respond. It was clear that Derek was both sympathetic and confused. He had worked with her on several cases and knew how hard she had worked to get to where she was. "Yeah," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "The judge fined me. He said it was for disrespect." But I don't understand why. I just don't get it. Derek stayed silent for a moment, clearly processing what she had just said. Then he spoke carefully. Listen, Marissa, judges like Daniels have a reputation for being tough, especially on young lawyers like us. But this is different. This feels personal. There's something off about it, something you need to figure out. I know, she whispered, her grip tightening on the wheel. But what am I supposed to do? Fight it? Just let it go. You've seen how it works. A fine's a fine, right? Derek's voice was firm. No, it's not just about the fine. It's about how they see you, how they treat you, what they think they can get away with. There's no way that fine was justified. Not in the slightest. You need to take action, Marissa. He was right, but Marissa didn't know where to start, what to do, or who to turn to for help. The legal world was full of unwritten rules, full of people who didn't hesitate to silence those who challenged authority. She had worked so hard to get here. She didn't want to risk losing it all because of a judge's vendetta, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her, it was about something bigger. The next few days were a blur. Marissa spent hours combing through court transcripts, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. She reached out to her mentor, David, the senior partner at her firm, hoping he could offer some guidance. When they met in his office, David listened carefully as Marissa recounted the events of that day, shaking his head slowly as he absorbed her story. It sounds like Judge Daniels has a history of treating young black lawyers this way, he said quietly after a long pause. I'm afraid you've stumbled into something bigger than a simple fine. Marissa's heart sank. She hadn't considered that possibility, but now that David had said it out loud, it felt painfully clear she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting against something much larger than she had imagined. Marissa sat in David's office, her mind spinning as the weight of his words settled in. She had hoped for clarity, some kind of direction on how to navigate the mess she found herself in. But instead, David's words had opened a door to a much larger problem. The idea that Judge Daniels' actions might not be isolated, but part of a pattern aimed at undermining young black professionals, hit her hard. She had always known that her journey in law would be challenging, that being a black woman in a predominantly white profession meant she had to work harder, be better. But this was different. This was personal. David's voice brought her back to the moment. Marissa, I don't want to scare you, but what you're dealing with here isn't just about one bad experience. Daniels is part of a larger network of judges who, whether consciously or not, hold biases that affect their decisions. And it's not just him. It's a culture that's deeply ingrained in the legal system. Marissa's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. She had heard of biased judges before, of course, but hearing it from David made it all feel more real, more urgent. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, always focusing on the cases, on the law. She had never thought about the weight of her race and gender in the same way. In the back of her mind, she had always believed that her talent would speak for itself, that she could rise above it all. But now, in the face of this unjust fine, she saw how deep the system's bias could run. But what do I do now? Marissa asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. If it's not just about the fine, what's the next step? David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You have to challenge this, not just for your own sake, but for others who are in the same position. This isn't just about your case, it's about setting a precedent. If we let this slide, it'll just keep happening. And if you don't speak up, who will? Her eyes widened. You want me to take this public? He nodded slowly. The Bar Association can't ignore it. You're already a part of it, even if you didn't know it. You were elected president months ago, and you have influence. You have a platform. The legal community respects you. Use it. Marissa felt a surge of anxiety. She had never intended to be in the spotlight, and now to be thrust into a leadership position felt overwhelming. She had always imagined herself quietly building her career, not leading a movement or calling out the biases within the system. But as the words sank in, something else clicked inside her. She had earned her place. She had worked tirelessly to get to where she was. And now she had a responsibility. A responsibility to herself, to her clients, and to the countless others who would face the same bias in silence if she did nothing. I don't know if I'm ready, she confessed, feeling a knot form in her stomach. I've never been one for confrontation. I don't want to risk everything for a fight I might not win. David smiled gently, understanding the weight of her hesitation. You don't have to do it alone. You've got allies. There are others who have been fighting this battle for years. But you, Marissa, you're in a unique position to change things. You can start that conversation. Marissa stared out the window, her mind racing. Could she really do this? Could she stand up not just for herself, but for every young lawyer who had ever felt small in the face of authority? She thought about the challenges she had already overcome, how hard she had worked to get here, and she realized maybe this was the moment she had been preparing for all along. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice steady now. I'll take it to the bar. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. David gave her a nod of approval. You've got this, Marissa. Don't let fear hold you back. The truth will always come out. As Marissa left David's office, the weight of what she had just committed to settled heavily on her shoulders. But there was also a sense of purpose growing inside her. She was no longer just a lawyer facing an unjust fine. She was a leader, and it was time for her to lead. Marissa spent the next few days in a whirlwind of preparation, organizing her thoughts, consulting with colleagues, and wrestling with her own doubts. The idea of taking the matter to the Bar Association felt increasingly daunting, but she knew that David was right. She couldn't let Judge Daniels' actions slide, not when they had the potential to affect so many others. She spent late nights drafting a formal letter, outlining the details of her encounter with the judge, the fine she had received, and the troubling treatment she had endured. The letter was respectful but firm, and most importantly, it clearly stated her intention to challenge the unfair fine, not just for her sake, but for the integrity of the legal community as a whole. By the time she finished the letter, she felt drained but determined. She could see the potential backlash in her mind. Would she be branded as a troublemaker? Would her colleagues turn their backs on her for stirring the pot? But no matter how much fear crept into her thoughts, she knew she couldn't stay silent. She hit send, and the letter was on its way to Judge Daniels. The moment the email left her inbox, Marissa felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The die was cast, and now she had no choice but to wait for his response. The days that followed were tense. Marissa continued with her daily duties, but her mind was never far from the letter she had sent. Every time she walked into her firm's office, she braced herself for a phone call, an email, or even a confrontation. She knew that challenging a judge wasn't something to take lightly, especially in a profession where power dynamics were so deeply entrenched. Yet she was resolute. On the third day after sending the letter, the response came. Marissa stared at the subject line. Asterisk, asterisk, response to your inquiry. Asterisk, asterisk, her hands shook slightly as she opened it, her breath catching in her chest. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that Judge Daniels might have reconsidered, that he would realize the unfairness of his decision and issue a quiet apology. But as she read through the email, that hope quickly faded. The judge's response was condescending and dismissive. He reaffirmed his decision, stating that the fine had been issued for her disrespectful behavior in his courtroom, citing specific moments during the hearing when he felt she had spoken out of turn. He then questioned her qualifications and her ability to lead the Bar Association, implying that someone so new to the gang shouldn't be so quick to challenge his authority. The letter ended with a chilling line. Asterisk, asterisk, perhaps next time you'll remember your place. Asterisk, asterisk. Marissa felt the blood drain from her face as she read the final words. Her initial shock gave way to anger. It wasn't just the fine anymore. It was the blatant attempt to diminish her, to take away her credibility and authority, not just as an attorney, but as a leader. She knew that this was no longer about one judge and one fine. This was about a system that had long dismissed the voices of people like her. She wasn't just fighting for fairness anymore. She was fighting for respect, for her place in the legal world. She took a few moments to steady her breathing, then picked up the phone. She called David, barely able to contain the tremor in her voice. He didn't just ignore me, David. He dismissed me completely. And not just as a lawyer. He attacked me as a person. He made it clear that he doesn't think I belong here. She paused, swallowing hard. What do I do now? David's voice was calm but firm. You fight back. You take it public. This isn't just about the fine. It's about making sure that people like him know they can't get away with this. You're the president of the bar now. This is your moment. The realization hit her all over again. She was no longer a lawyer quietly fighting for her career. She was the leader of an organization, and with that title came the responsibility to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone in the legal community who had ever faced discrimination, bias, or injustice. "I'll do it," Marissa said, her voice steady now, a newfound determination burning within her. "I'll take this to the bar. I'll make sure everyone knows what's happening. This ends now." As she hung up the phone, Marissa felt the weight of what was ahead of her. It was a fight that would take everything she had, but it was a fight she was ready to win. The following days were a blur of activity for Marissa, but the weight of the decision she had made lingered in her mind. She had sent the letter to Judge Daniels, and now she was preparing to take the next step, making the issue public. The idea of confronting a powerful figure like Daniels was daunting, yet every time she doubted herself, she thought back to the injustice she had faced in his courtroom. She couldn't back down. Not now, not when it was no longer just about her. It was about every young lawyer of color who had been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced. Marissa decided to bring the matter before the State Bar Association. She called for an emergency meeting, ensuring that it would be attended by influential members of the bar, senior attorneys, and judges. She needed their support, or this fight would be over before it even began. But the moment she made the request, a knot formed in her stomach. She wasn't sure she was ready to lead this charge. Her experience in the bar had always been behind the scenes, never in the spotlight. But as the president, she had an obligation to represent the interests of all attorneys, particularly those who faced discrimination. Marissa spent hours drafting a statement. She was meticulous, ensuring her words were powerful but measured. She didn't want to sound emotional or reactive, but she also didn't want to water down the gravity of the situation. Her argument was simple. Judge Daniels' treatment of her wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem, a pattern of dismissive behavior toward young black attorneys that was damaging the integrity of the legal system. When the day of the meeting arrived, Marissa felt a mix of nerves and resolve. She walked into the conference room with her head held high, but her heart was beating in her chest. The room was filled with the usual faces of the Bar Association, lawyers, judges, and the legal elite of the city. But as Marissa stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanned the faces of the people who would decide if this issue would be taken seriously. She had no illusions. Some of these people had been in the legal world for decades. They were entrenched in the system, and Marissa couldn't help but wonder how many of them shared Judge Daniels' biases. But she pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about them. It was about making sure that no one else had to endure what she had gone through. Marissa opened the meeting with a brief introduction, then launched into her account of what had happened in Judge Daniels' courtroom. She described how the fine had been imposed unfairly, how Daniels had insulted her professionalism, and how the fine had been justified with a vague accusation of disrespect. She spoke with authority, her voice unwavering, as she laid out the facts, hoping the room would listen. But as she spoke, a silence settled over the room. Some attendees exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others simply stared at her, absorbing her words. When she finished, there was a long pause. Marissa's pulse quickened. Had she lost them? Was this just another case of a young black woman making waves, only to be dismissed once more? Finally, one of the senior members of the bar, Sophia spoke up. "I've seen this behavior before, and I'm ashamed to admit that it's been brushed aside for far too long," she said, her voice firm but sympathetic. "Marissa is right. This isn't just about one judge. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. It was a small crack in the armor, but it was enough to give Marissa hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Sophia continued, addressing the room. "We need to make it clear that this kind of treatment won't be tolerated, whether it's a judge, a lawyer, or anyone else in our community. We have a responsibility to make sure that all members of the legal profession are treated with fairness and respect." Marissa felt a wave of relief wash over her. Sophia's words weren't just support, they were a call to action. The Bar Association, it seemed, was ready to back her. But Marissa knew that this was just the beginning. She had to keep the momentum going, make sure that Judge Daniels' actions didn't just fade into the background. This fight would take everything she had, and then some. As the meeting continued, more voices joined in, expressing their concerns about the state of the legal system and the implicit biases that were too often allowed to fester unchecked. By the time the meeting adjourned, Marissa felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had allies now. Powerful, influential allies. The legal community was finally listening, and she was ready to lead the charge. The next step was clear. She would take her case public. She would make sure that everyone knew what had happened and how the system had failed her. And with the Bar Association behind her, Marissa knew the fight was just beginning. The momentum Marissa had gained at the Bar Association meeting began to build quickly. She was no longer just a young lawyer fighting an unjust fine. She had become a symbol of something larger, a beacon for those who felt overlooked or oppressed in a system that had long been stacked against them. The support from her colleagues in the bar was a powerful catalyst, but the real work had just begun. She knew that in order for this to truly make a difference, she had to take her story beyond the walls of the courthouse and into the public eye. Over the next week, Marissa worked tirelessly with a team of allies to craft a public statement. She spoke with media outlets, lawyers, and public relations experts to ensure that her message would be clear and impactful. She wasn't going to just air her grievances. She was going to spark a broader conversation about bias, injustice, and accountability in the legal system. She felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Taking the issue public meant risking personal attacks, a loss of professional credibility, and the possibility of backlash. But at the same time, it was an opportunity to make real change. When the press release was finally ready, Marissa reviewed it one last time, making sure every word was measured, every point articulated with precision. It was a powerful statement, highlighting not just the specific incident with Judge Daniels, but the pervasive culture of bias that often went unchecked. Marissa's words were firm, but they remained professional. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. She was fighting for the dignity of all those who had been silenced for far too long. The press release went out late on a Friday evening, and by the following morning, it had already gained traction. Media outlets were picking it up, and social media began buzzing with commentary. The support was overwhelming. Young Black attorneys, law students, and even seasoned legal professionals from across the country sent messages of encouragement, sharing their own stories of discrimination or bias in the legal field. But with the support came the inevitable pushback. Some within the legal community questioned her motives, accusing her of making a mountain out of a molehill. Others claimed that she was playing the race card and undermining the integrity of the judicial system. Marissa knew this was coming, but it still stung. The comments were painful, but they also reaffirmed why she was doing this. If the system were truly fair and just, these voices wouldn't exist. The fact that they did made her more determined than ever to keep fighting. Marissa also began receiving messages from other attorneys who had faced similar treatment. Many shared their stories in private, wary of speaking out publicly for fear of repercussions. These stories confirmed what Marissa had suspected. Judge Daniels wasn't an anomaly. There was a silent, systemic issue that extended far beyond his courtroom, one that wasn't talked about enough within the legal community. As the media storm continued to grow, Marissa found herself thrust into the spotlight. She was invited to appear on news programs, podcasts, and interviews discussing the broader implications of her case. Each time she spoke, her resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was advocating for a change that was long overdue. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of interviews, Marissa sat at her kitchen table, reflecting on everything that had happened so far. She was proud of how far she had come, but she also knew the real battle was still ahead. The public attention was important, but it had to lead to action. She couldn't let the conversation fizzle out. She needed to push for real reforms, not just within the bar, but across the entire legal system. The fight had just begun. That night, she called David. "We've made it this far, but we have to keep going," she said, determination in her voice. "This is bigger than just one case. This is about changing the culture of the entire profession." David's voice was steady, reassuring. "You're doing great, Marissa. But you're right, it's just the beginning. But remember, you're not alone. There are people who believe in you and, more importantly, believe in the change you're fighting for." Marissa smiled, feeling a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future where young Black attorneys didn't have to fear being dismissed, where their voices were heard, and where justice truly meant justice for all. The journey ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but Marissa was ready. She would see this fight through to the end, no matter what it took. The weeks that followed were both exhilarating and exhausting for Marissa. The media attention hadn't died down, and her story had gone viral in a way she hadn't anticipated. Articles, think pieces, and opinion columns were published across major outlets, some praising her courage and others questioning her intentions. But amid the noise, Marissa remained focused. She knew that this moment, this very public confrontation with Judge Daniels, could be the catalyst for something much bigger. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about transforming a culture that had allowed discrimination and bias to persist unchecked for so long. Marissa's phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters, allies, and even law students seeking guidance. She'd expected some of it, but not at this scale. Each interview was an opportunity to further explain why this fight was necessary, but it also came with the pressure of answering tough questions and confronting the uncomfortable truths about the legal system. Every time she spoke, she made sure her message was clear. This wasn't an attack on the judiciary. It was a demand for fairness, accountability, and reform. One afternoon, as Marissa was preparing for another televised interview, she received a call from Sophia the senior member of the bar who had publicly supported her during the emergency meeting. "I've been hearing a lot of rumblings, Marissa," Sophia said, her tone serious. "There's movement from the higher-ups, people who want to sweep this under the rug. They're starting to push for a settlement, something to make this all go away quietly. I think they see your story as a threat to the status quo." Marissa's heart sank. A settlement? It sounded too much like a way for those in power to avoid accountability. "They want me to back down?" she asked, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "Exactly. They'll try to make it seem like it's in your best interest, that you'll be better off if you let this go," Sophia warned. "But if you accept it, nothing will change. You'll just become another case they can point to as proof that the system works. You'll lose the opportunity to create real change." Sophia's words hit Marissa hard. She thought back to everything that had led her here, the injustice of the fine, the way Judge Daniels had tried to dismiss her, the way so many others had silently endured the same treatment. If she backed down now, all of it would have been for nothing. "I'm not going to let them make it go away," Marissa said, her voice hardening with resolve. "I'm in this for the long haul, Sophia. I'm not giving up." Sophia let out a relieved sigh. "I knew you'd say that. You're doing something important here, Marissa. Don't let them intimidate you into silence. I'll help you keep pushing. The bar is watching, and there are many people who are ready for this change. We just need to keep the pressure on." The next day, Marissa made her decision. She would not settle. She would take this fight all the way. She began to organize a movement within the legal community, drawing together like-minded professionals who were also ready to stand up against the entrenched biases they had long ignored. Lawyers, judges, and law students came forward, pledging their support. She also made a plan to meet with lawmakers. If the legal system itself wouldn't change, then perhaps the legislature could help initiate reforms. She couldn't just fight in the courtrooms. She needed to change the laws that allowed these kinds of biases to persist. The movement began to take shape, and Marissa felt the weight of the responsibility growing heavier, but also more purposeful. The pushback from those who wanted to bury the issue grew fiercer. Marissa received threats, some veiled, others more direct, warning her to back off or face the consequences. But with every threat, she found herself more resolute. If she had to be the face of this fight, she would stand tall. She knew she wasn't just fighting for her own dignity, but for the dignity of countless others who had been sidelined or silenced. She looked back at the progress she had made so far, the voices of support growing louder, the barriers beginning to crack. The journey was long, but she was not turning back now. The fight had just begun, and with each step, Marissa knew she was moving closer to the change she had always dreamed of. The months that followed were a whirlwind for Marissa. What began as a personal battle against an unjust fine had evolved into a movement. The support she garnered from across the legal community, along with the media coverage, had opened the door for larger conversations about systemic bias and the need for reform within the legal system. But with this newfound influence came even greater challenges. The pressure mounted as she faced not only personal attacks, but also fierce opposition from powerful figures within the judiciary and legal establishments. Yet Marissa refused to back down. She was no longer just advocating for herself. She was fighting for the future of a legal profession that could no longer ignore the biases that ran through its very foundations. Her resolve was unwavering. With each interview, each meeting with lawmakers, and each public speech, her mission became clearer. She wanted to ensure that no one, especially those from marginalized communities, would ever have to endure what she had. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Lawmakers, influenced by the groundswell of public support, began to take notice. Bills aimed at tackling racial bias within the judicial system were drafted, and several state bar associations called for reviews of their own policies. But it wasn't just the political and professional gains that mattered to Marissa. It was the personal victories. One afternoon, she sat in her office, looking out over the city, reflecting on the journey she had taken. The initial shock of Judge Daniel's fine felt like a distant memory now. It had been a defining moment, but it was just the beginning of something much bigger than she could have imagined. As her phone rang, breaking her reverie, she glanced at the screen and saw that it was Sophia. "Marissa, I just wanted to check in," Sophia's voice said when she picked up. "You've been moving mountains. I've never seen anything like it. There's talk at the bar about forming a special committee to address the systemic issues you've been highlighting. It's a huge win." Marissa smiled, feeling the weight of Sophia's words sink in. This was the tangible change she had been fighting for. "It's hard to believe sometimes, but we're making progress. Every day, I feel like we're moving closer." "Don't stop now. People are watching you," Sophia urged. "The work you've done has lit a fire under so many people in our profession. You've inspired others to speak up. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us." Marissa paused, taking a deep breath. "I never imagined this kind of momentum. At first, it felt like I was standing alone, but now it feels like there's a movement, and it's bigger than anything I could have started on my own. I couldn't have done this without the support I've had." Sophia's voice softened. "And we're not done yet. Keep pushing. There's a lot of work left to do, but you've already changed the game." Marissa hung up, feeling the weight of her responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. She had come so far, but she knew the journey wasn't over. The fight for fairness, for equality, for a justice system that truly served everyone was ongoing. The more she learned, the more she saw just how deeply entrenched the biases were. But for the first time in a long while, Marissa felt a sense of hope. The tide was turning. As she prepared for yet another round of meetings, press conferences, and legislative talks, Marissa felt a surge of confidence. She had started this fight alone, with only her own sense of justice driving her forward. But now she had allies in high places, a community of professionals who believed in the same cause, and a growing base of support from the public. She wasn't just Marissa anymore, the young attorney who had been fined for challenging a judge. She was Marissa, the leader who had shown the world that change was possible. And as she walked into the next meeting, she felt ready for whatever came next. The system was on the cusp of transformation, and she was determined to see it through. Marissa knew that true change would take time, and the fight would never be easy. But with each victory, each small step forward, she was proving that the future of law could be different. A future where fairness, integrity, and equality stood as the foundation for all who entered the profession. and she was going to make sure that no one would ever have to fight alone again.